his smile.
I am become death. Tales Under a Broken Sky, Episode 33. The Muse. I need to tell you something. I know you're not going to believe me, but it's the truth of the matter. I know you must hear that all the time, but what happened, what I did, it wasn't my fault. It wasn't me. It wasn't anything that I had ever intended to happen. You must understand something. When I met her, that first time, I was desperate. My first book had been a bestseller, outselling even my wildest dreams. It was a whirlwind, sold out book signings, convention invites, award nominations, and the ever-important royalty check. So when my publisher approached me with a 2-book contract to expand on the story, I jumped at the chance. I'd pinched pennies for years while I tried to get my writing career off the ground. When the offer came in and I saw the generous advance, I just jumped at the opportunity. It was everything that I had dreamed of, right? Financial independence, living through my art, no more drunk college students, deadbeats, and casual drinkers with no fucking etiquette. I signed on the spot, barely taking the time to read the contract, and cutting my agent short when they wanted to negotiate. The payday was good. I was riding high after the success of my first book, and had no reservations about the next one being at least equally successful. Being a fool, I didn't even think twice about the proposed time frame for delivery of the books. I drafted the first one in a few months after all, hadn't I? And this time, I had editors and proofreaders at my disposal, didn't I? I now know that I shouldn't have been so cocky, but back then, 7 years ago, I felt invincible, like the universe had finally aligned for me, and everything was going to be smooth sailing from there on out. I mean, I was wrong. That much is evident now. I should have seen the signs. In a Mortal Way was never meant to be any more than a standalone story. I had tied up all the plot lines nice and neatly. The dead were dead, the living were living, and there wasn't anything to be said on the subject. The idea was floated, and I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. Never mind that I had no idea where to take things past the first book, or that I hadn't written a word since Mortal Way found the home. In my head, I was taking a break, a well-deserved rest after pouring my soul into the book. And I needed some space after all, didn't I? All that touring and travelling had taken it out of me, and I was tired. I was never short of ideas, snippets of stories jotted down in the battered notebook that followed me everywhere. It seemed easy, didn't it? Once the contract was signed, I'd peruse those coffee-stained pages, trying concepts and scenes on for size, fitting them into the world I had created. Easy, no problem, not a bother. Except when that advance hit my bank account, enough to keep me comfortable for a few years, and I finally sat down to write again, the words just didn't come. The blank page on my computer screen became a screaming void. The blinking cursor taunted me with its steady cadence, and my mind became a cacophony of overlapping sentences and ideas. Day after day, week after week, month after month, I struggled. Sitting at my desk, staring at the screen for 12 hours a day, a steady stream of coffee, nicotine, and weed sustaining my fruitless non-activity. I tried. I really did. But every time I put my fingers on the keyboard to start typing, the images and ideas that had been so clear in my head only moments before fled, deserting me when I most needed them. I didn't know how to cope with that. I'd never had writer's block before, never had to deal with that absence, that complete and total lack of inspiration. Surely somewhere within my notes there was a hint of an idea, a tiny nugget of gold that would lead to a prosperous vein. If I could just keep chipping away, just keep probing at the cracks, the facade would fall away to reveal what I needed. I read and reread Mortal Way, a self-flagellating pursuit that resulted in nothing but crushing despair and apathy. I started to question my talent, my success, my love for the written word. Pretty soon, a decent splash of whiskey joined my morning coffee, a desperate counterpart to the cheap bottles of red that had become a staple of my evenings. But that page stayed blank. That cursor continued to blink its steady rhythm, and I continued to spiral. I want you to understand. I've always been a neat person. Everything in my life arranged just so. But as my desperation took hold, this all began to slip. First, it was the silly things, skipping shaving for a day, or leaving a few coffee mugs in the sink overnight. But soon, I found myself tending to a month of beard growth, an untended mane of hair that refused to behave, and stacks of dirty dishes that had migrated from the sink to the kitchen counter and then to the dining table. An exodus of crockery and silverware that was only halted when demand exceeded supply, and clean plates and teaspoons became a precious commodity. If you'd described that scene to me even a year ago, I would have said I'd reached rock bottom then, an unkempt, perpetually hungover, and washed up one-hit wonder. The truth is, that wasn't rock bottom. Back then, I could never have imagined how far one could fall. I started to ignore calls from my agent, pushing back the hard conversations I didn't want to have. I just needed a few weeks, just a few more weeks. If I could just find a rhythm, a modicum of cadence, some kind of steady flow, then everything would be all right. Editing and manhandling the books into shape would be an easy job once I got the bones of the story down on paper. That was the hard part, I reassured myself, but it will all come together. But that moment remained elusive. After one particularly bad day, when my pores were particularly heavy-handed, and I lacked the enthusiasm to clean a glass for my wine, instead opting to use my dirty coffee mug so I didn't have to leave my desk, I finally broke. I needed to make the call, admit I was a failure, and move on with my life. Did it matter, after all? How many aspiring writers never even came as close as I had to fulfilling their dreams? I'd had a taste of success, of the life that I wanted, but maybe it simply wasn't meant to be. I'd made up my mind. I'd call my agent in the morning and put an end to the whole horrid affair. Then, not wanting to think any more about the matter, I resolved to drink myself into oblivion that evening, wreathed in a cloud of smoke, and watching B-movie horror until the world and my problems ceased to exist. I pulled on my last respectable set of clothes, although that in itself is a misnomer, and doused myself in a week's worth of deodorant to hide the smell of smoke and stale wine. The off-license was only around the corner anyway, and it was late. Who was going to see me? That was when I met her. On any other day, I would have passed her without notice. In the depths of my self-destructive plunge, women were the furthest thing from my mind. I can't tell you to this day what it was about her that caught my attention. She was pretty, sure, but not in an eye-catching, stop-dead in the street kind of way. She was leaning nonchalantly against the wall of the shop, a cigarette dangling loosely in one hand and her phone in the other, her thumb slowly swiping across the screen. I nodded at her as I passed, and did my best to utter a good evening that didn't sound like a primordial grunt as I reached for the door. That was when she looked up from her phone at me. I remember that moment with utter clarity, the momentary look of surprise on her face before it morphed through confusion recognition, and disbelief, before her eyes lit up and a smile spread across her face. In a mortal way, right? Her voice was bright and clear, with just a faint edge of uncertainty and hesitant excitement underpinning her question. I stopped and stood for a moment, with my hand on the door, head half turned towards her in surprise. It only took those 5 words to realize how isolated I had become. When was the last time I had an actual conversation with another person? Days? Weeks? My cheeks flushed in embarrassment at her words. Did I want myself, as I was at that moment, to be associated with something that had been my proudest achievement? What did they say? Never meet your idols? I wasn't that far gone to assume my writing was important enough to anyone, at least to that extent. But neither did I want the image of who I was to be tarnished by what I had become. I should have just shaken my head and moved on, claimed the passing resemblance to the author in question, and moved on. But something in the way she was looking at me gave me pause, and I turned to face her fully. Not at my best, I'm afraid, but yes. My voice was harsh in my throat, the words catching awkwardly. Christ, when was the last time I talked? At least more than the few short grunts required to buy alcohol. She turned to face me as I spoke, and her eyes widened even further. I'm a huge fan, sir. Would you mind signing my copy? I stepped back instinctively as she moved closer and reached into her bag. It had been so long since I was in voluntary proximity to someone that the closeness felt too intimate, too claustrophobic. Then I saw her copy of my book, a battered, dog-eared mess. The pages warped in one corner by a visible coffee stain, the cover wrinkled and torn and vertical lines running down the whole width of the spine. I'd never been precious about my own book collection. To me, books are made to be touched, handled and loved. There are no books more precious to me on my shelves than those that I have read and reread repeatedly. I felt a deep stab of pride at the condition of her copy. It had clearly been read multiple times, carried on her person, slept on as she dozed in bed, sat near her as she had her morning coffee. It was worn in the way that a favourite pair of shoes or jeans become battered and faded over time. Only 2 years from publication, my book was clearly no Tolkien or King, something that had been carried from childhood, a cherished copy that was reached for again and again over the years. It seemed to me at that moment that the condition of her book was the greatest compliment she could have paid me. It had been part of her life. She had lived with it and reached for it a humbling number of times in its short existence. So, when I responded by saying that I didn't have a pen on me, you might understand just how flustered I was by the situation. But despite my fumbled, ineloquent words, she just laughed, a bright tinkle under the light of the street lamps, and slipped a pen from her bag. Of course, silly me, of course not. If it's not too much trouble. I took the pen and book from her, and opened it on the cover page. Who do I make it out to? Callie would be just fine. I scrawled something pithy. I was going for heartfelt, but so was my life, on the page, and signed my name with a flourish, before handing it back to her. Before she took it back, she looked me in the eye, and swallowed. Can I ask a question? I'll do my best to answer, but if it's about the next book, I don't know. I hate to disappoint, but progress has been slower than I would have hoped. Her eyes dropped in disappointment, and I felt like an absolute prick from my gruff, blunt manner. But before I could apologise, she set her shoulders and looked back at me. It was, I guess. I hope you find your inspiration again. I'm dying to find out what happens to Megan after she gets away. If she hadn't taken the book from my hand at that moment, I would have dropped it. Megan, of course. How had I been so stupid? I had tied up all the plot lines in the first book. Or at least, I had always thought I had. But towards the end of the book, only a handful of pages really, I had alluded to something in that character's past that had since gone unexplored. What a fool I had been. 2 years of gradual decline and self-destruction, and in the space of a minute, less even, this woman a random encounter, just as I was on the verge of giving up entirely, had provided me with the key to my salvation. Even as I stood there, staring awestruck at this unassuming woman, the story was beginning to form in my mind, images and dialogue forcing their way to the front of my thoughts and banishing all the pain and self-doubt I had inflicted on myself. I felt my mind clearing for the first time in years, the noise and the conflict draining through the hole that Callie had just ripped through the fog that clouded my brain. "Are you okay?" Her bright, cheery tone broke me from my trance, and I realized I had slumped back against the wall, staring blankly at the streetlights overhead. Yes, sorry, sorry, I think I just figured something out to get me back on track. Thank you. You've been a great help." She smiled at me, and if I knew what I knew now, I would have recognized the knowing look in her eyes, the satisfaction that curled the edges of her smile. But I was too blinded by the intense rush of inspiration to pay any notice. With another rushed apology, I left her standing outside the off-license and headed back towards my apartment, words, images, and emotions hammering against my temple. I felt like I was going to explode if I didn't get the words out, release them after years of inactivity. I won't bore you with the details, but once I got back to my apartment, I fell into a trance. The world ceased to exist around me. There was just the story, and nothing else. That weekend was a flurry of writing. I've never experienced anything like it. The words flowed from my fingers and onto the screen like a dam had burst inside me. I forgot to eat, drink, sleep, wash. The desperate need for the next drink, the next toke, was gone, replaced by an all-consuming need to express the story that until a few days ago I didn't even know existed. I finished sometime on Sunday night and sent the first draft to my agent before falling into a stupor. When I awoke on Tuesday afternoon, I had a plethora of missed calls and an inbox full of hurried emails. They loved it, read it straight through, better than the first, they said. They sent it straight on to the publisher when I didn't get back to them. They didn't even see the need for edits. Still in shock from the unexpected nature of what had just occurred, I looked across the room and caught a glance of myself in the mirror. I barely recognized myself. I looked old, grey streaking my previous dark hair, my beard long and dishevelled, and my shoulders hunched and narrower than I remembered. When was the last time I even looked in a mirror? You might call that the moment I hit rock bottom, the moment of clarity when I realised that I couldn't keep going on the way I had been. But you'd be wrong. My second book hit, with even a bigger fanfare than the first. More sales, more nominations, more awards, more invites, more touring. If the first book had turned my life around, then the second revolutionized it. I cleaned myself up, put back on the weight I lost, got sober, and bought my first house. I thought my troubles had ended with Death's Bastard. It was more open-ended than the first, leaving a clear path for the third book. No problem, I thought. I would settle down after the touring and promotions died down and get to work on it. Not at the frantic pace of the second, but certainly without the 2-year gap in productivity. 6 months after I returned from my last signing, that wasn't the case, and I found myself once again sitting in front of a blank page, in nicer surroundings this time, wondering how had it all gone wrong again. And so it was, almost a year to the day after my encounter with Callie, that I found myself once again standing outside the off-license, with a growing desperation twisting my gut. I don't know why I had expected to see her there, or why my heart fell in disappointment when she wasn't standing outside, smoking her cigarette and doom-scrolling on her phone. I hesitated at the door. I knew this wasn't the way, but the memory of my previous experience was still fresh in my mind, the aura of uncontrolled panic and anxiety. All I could think of doing was take the edge off, even for a few hours. I pushed open the door impulsively before I could lose my nerve and stepped inside. And there she was, standing by one of the shelves, cradling a bottle of Chianti and inspecting the label diligently. When she looked up at me, my heart stopped, until that look of recognition came into her eyes, and that subtle smile spread across her face. "You're looking well for yourself, mortal way. Your last book caused quite a sensation, didn't it? Well deserved, I'd say. Not many people know how much you've suffered for your art." Her new demeanour came as a bit of a shock to me. The first time I'd met her, she'd come across as shy, if a bit forward, asking for my signature. This time, however, she radiated a brash confidence that caught me off guard. "At a loss for words? I thought you'd found your inspiration again. Or have you lost it?" I stared dumbly at her. The previously satisfied smile on her face took on a nasty texture, resembling a sneer more than anything else. I didn't know what to say, and even if I did, she continued before I could say anything. "I'm surprised you broke so easily. With your success, you think you'd have more room to negotiate. Oh well, so's life. You need some help again?" I nodded slowly, still unsure of myself. I mean, I didn't think it could hurt at the time. The last time I met her, it had just been a few words that sparked my inspiration. How could that hurt anyone? She put the wine down with a shake of her head. "No quality in this world anymore. Right, come on, let's go." She pushed past me out of the shop and led me down the street. "See, your problem, mortal way, is that you're writing about things you don't know, that you don't truly understand. If you want to truly be great at what you do, and it's not all that difficult really, you're not a Homer or a Shakespeare by any stretch, then you need to experience it for yourself." We turned a corner, and she led me across the road and into the park. It was mostly empty at that hour, not yet closed for the evening, but still dark enough to make me uneasy. No one hung around the park at that hour, unless they had business to conduct. She led me down one of the side paths that I guess led towards the lake, and I was surprised to see someone still out running. A man, less surprising than a woman at that hour, but it still caught me off guard. Without warning, Callie started to run towards the jogger, her voice raised and hands flailing in the air above her head. Before I had a chance to think, the man had slowed to a stop next to her, and she raised her arm and pointed in my direction. He looked up and took a step towards me, then fell to his knees. Confused, I took a step forward and watched as he lurched forward and hit the ground face first. In the shadows, I didn't see the knife protruding from his back until I was right on top of him. "What the fuck, Callie? What have you done?" "I've done nothing, darling. He's not even dead yet, and won't be for hours. It will be a long, lingering death, too. I'm going to call the ambulance, then." I want you to know that at that moment, I'd had enough of whatever game she was playing. Nothing was worth that. But she just laughed as I turned to leave. "And who are they going to believe? You, or the poor woman accosted by a perverted writer who went on to kill an innocent bystander who intervened? They're not going to find my fingerprints on that knife. Maybe you should look closer." I turned back, the skin on my neck prickling. Returning to the body, I bent down and examined the handle of the knife. It could have been any knife, really. Just a standard cheap kitchen knife, except for the slight piece of melted plastic at the end of the handle, from where I had carelessly left it overhang the stovetop. "What the fuck have you done, you fucking crazy bitch? Why are you doing this to me?" Callie smirked, the nearest street lamp casting sharp shadows across her face. "You asked for this. You wanted inspiration? Well, there it is. Now you know what it's like to see someone being stabbed in the back. You think this is going to help me?" "Heavens no. That's the next part. You're going to put this poor man out of his misery." I recoiled and then froze. There was no way out of the trap I had fallen into. My fingerprints were going to be all over that knife. Entrapment. Was that the word? Catch-22? Damned if I do, damned if I don't. I looked back over at Callie, and she just shrugged back. A lazy motion, as if she was bored and just wanted to get things over with. "You have a choice. Leave, and you'll spend the rest of your life in prison. Or do what I tell you to, and you will continue to find the success that you crave." I looked between the mad woman and the dying man with a sense of growing inevitability, and I reached for the knife. I am speaking the truth, When I say I don't know what took over me then, but when I came back to my senses, I was back in my house, slumped in the shower, cold water spraying my face. The runoff, slowly meandering towards the drain, stained red. I was terrified, but everything was clear as day once again. The entirety of my next book just floating there at the front of my mind, just sitting there, ready for me to take. So once again, I let that alien feeling take its hold on me. 3 days later, my next manuscript was with my agent, and they were already singing my praises. If you've looked into me, which I'm sure you have, then you'll know that my third book outsold the other two combined. Production and broadcast companies coming out of the woodwork to bid for film rights. More awards, more money, more fame, and another 3-book contract from my publisher. Yes, I know, it was blood money. I didn't even really understand it that morning, not until I turned on the news anyway, saw online articles about a brutal knife attack in the park, and read the descriptions that had been leaked onto some less than savoury news sites I use for research. I was physically sick. Everything about that night in the park matched exactly with the events in my story. I panicked and almost turned down the deal. I planned to claim burnout. I wanted to take time off from writing for a few years, but when I called my agent, they weren't having any of it. They were understanding, sure, empathized with the stress and tension of producing 3 best-selling novels in as many years. They were already worried about the strain, so they had hired a personal assistant for me. In fact, they were already on their way over to meet me. The moment I hung up the phone, there was a knock at the door. When I answered, Callie was standing outside. That sadistic, knowing smile stretched across her face. I tried to say no. I tried to back out. But every time she had me down to rights. Pictures, recordings, video, every single act of violence and depravity that I had committed in the name of inspiration, fame, and fortune. All there, held in front of my nose like a poisoned carrot. I know that I said I tried, but each time it became just that little bit easier. The money, the fame, the success. It was intoxicating. By the time I started to write my 7th book, there was no need for her to threaten me anymore. She just pointed me in the right direction. By book 10, she didn't even need to go with me anymore. By book 12, I was picking my own targets. When it came time to start work on my 13th book, she was gone. That's when it all came crashing down. Whatever charm, whatever magic or supernatural force she was exerting on me. Whatever it was that was allowing me to churn out bestseller after bestseller, it went with her. I tried to do book 13 the right way. I swear I tried to sit down and find a skill and talent I had lost years ago. But nothing came. There was just a yawning void of mediocrity and disappointment. And that's when you caught me. When I killed that girl, that poor girl who stayed behind at the playground after her friends left. I stood over her body with the bloodied bat and waited for the inspiration to come as it had so many times before. But there was nothing. Just that endless nothing. And her battered body lying at my feet. I don't know what she wanted or how she did what she did. I don't even think I care to know anymore. I did the things I did, some of them willingly, but I will fight to my dying breath that I was never given a choice. I don't know if you've seen the news recently, that journalist who just published the book profiling me and my actions. She was standing front and center in the crowd when he accepted his Pulitzer. Right there, that fucking smile plastered to her face. And I swear that she looked directly at me through the camera. Right into the fucking camera. None of that will matter after tonight though, will it? I refused my last meal, you know. All I requested was a bottle of cheap bourbon and a joint. They denied the second half of my request. I suppose we can't have it every way, can we? Welcome, folks, to episode 33 of Tales Under a Broken Sky. I am your host, Keith, and I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I have a notebook that I write all of my random ideas, concepts, and stories, or orphaned scenes and dialogue in. This story did not come out of there. I was going through a little dry spell after Christmas between work, some personal stuff, and just not having enough time. I was finding it hard to sit down and work through some ideas, and I was feeling reluctant to tackle some of my work-in-progress stories while my head wasn't quite in the space. One thing I do when I'm struggling is to sit down and write to a prompt, anything from flash fiction and poetry to full-length short stories. I find trying to build ideas around the prompt helps to focus my thinking and allows me to get words down onto paper without the baggage of trying to work around an idea I had already fleshed out. It gives me freedom in terms of tone, writing style, narration, and genre, and just lets me write without worrying about fitting the prose into a pre-formed idea or plot. I can't remember the exact prompt for this, and I can't find where I saved it, but it was something along the lines of struggling artist meets their muse, but the muse's intentions aren't benevolent, or something like that anyway. I always find it interesting how a thought can just take off, and I ended up writing the story in just a couple of hours, most of which were actually spent during a tattoo session. I suppose given the fact that I myself was struggling with a little bit of writer's block, it was easy to transfer those feelings of frustration onto paper and then in turn amplify them as the background of the story and take it in the thriller horror direction. I was actually really proud of this one. It's not very often that a story just flows onto the page, and I only had to stop maybe 2 or 3 times while working on this to think about where I wanted to take things. I was writing this on a deadline for magazine submission as well, so I was extra happy that it was an easy one to draft and I actually managed to get it out ahead of time. For those of you interested in reading the prose version of this, you can actually check it out over in volume 4 of The Dark Corner at thedarkcorner.blog, a new Irish-based horror magazine that has lots of fantastic new stories coming out in it. The other stories that feature in this particular volume are also as creepy as fuck. In other podcast-related news, I'm going to be taking a short break for the summer after the next episode of the podcast. I have a busy season ahead of work and some travel plans, and I want to spend some time catching up on my long-form projects that aren't part of the podcast, as well as getting some of the groundwork done for future episodes of the podcast. I plan to start up with Season 2 in September with a new slate of short stories, and continuing on with the serialized stories I started in Season 1. I have a few new ideas I'm looking to incorporate into the podcast as well. The next episode will be a long-form breakdown of Carmilla that I narrated across the last 6 episodes. I want to spend a bit of time exploring the story, themes, and the impact this classic has had on the genre in the 150 years or so since it was first penned. Once I wrap up Season 1, I'm actually going to be releasing a print version of all the original short stories that appeared in the season, alongside an audiobook version containing both newly narrated versions of the stories alongside the original podcast productions. I expect to have this out late July, early August. So that's it for now. I'm looking forward to getting back to work on some of my side projects that need a little bit of TLC, and then getting back on track with the podcast after the summer. Until next time. Thank you for listening to episode 33 of Tales Under a Broken Sky. I hope you enjoyed this week's production as much as I enjoyed writing and recording it. If you did enjoy it, please consider liking and subscribing to the podcast on your platform of choice and sharing with your friends. This will really help the show and keep me motivated to produce more content. Thank you again for your time.